Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
If you want the hook that makes people sit up, here it is in one breath that still burns when I say it out loud. My parents took my sister to a five-star resort for what they called family time. They told me it was not really my kind of thing and that I would be happier staying back and keeping an eye on the house, and when they came home with their tan lines and souvenir mugs, I was not there, and the people who opened the front door were not them. I am not telling you this like a movie pitch or some neat story with music under it. I am saying it to you the way I would say it at a kitchen table with tired coffee, because that is where the truth lands. I am the older daughter who learned very early that being useful earns you just enough space to be ignored. I am the one who picks people up from the airport, knows the password to the streaming account, remembers the dentist appointments, and pays the deposits when someone forgets, and my sister, Brooke, is the star performer who never leaves the stage and never gets asked to stack chairs when the show ends. They called it a family reset trip, which is funny because apparently reset only had room for 3 people, and I was not one of them. The excuse shifted each time I pushed for clarity. First it was limited rooms at the resort. Then it was that Brooke needed this after such a hard year. Then it was that I am so busy with work and they did not want to stress me, and the cherry on top was the request that I water the plants, sign for any packages, and make sure the trash bins go out on the right day, which is the kind of responsibility that gets handed to you with a smile and a pat on the shoulder as if it is a medal. I kept my voice level and said sure, because I've learned that begging for a seat just sets you up to be blamed for the tone you used, and I watched their car leave like I was watching a rerun, because it always plays the same. The group text lit up with photos of the resort pool and plates of food and a caption about how the staff greeted them by name, while my phone screen reflected my own face and the same house where I have been the emergency plan since forever, and I felt that old mix of anger and embarrassment slide into place, except this time it did not stop at hurt. It kept moving into something colder and clearer. I did what I always do when I want to stop spiraling, which is to do the next boring task in front of me. I sorted the mail, I cleaned the fridge. I opened the cabinet where my grandmother's papers sit because nobody can agree whether to file them or keep them in the original envelopes, and I started reading, not for drama, but because it was there and my hands needed a job. And that is when I found the copy of the deed that my grandmother changed before she passed, the one my parents never talk about because it did not fit their version of who owns what and who owes whom, and my name was on it, not as a witness, not as a child listed in a holiday letter, but as someone who has an actual share in the house that they treat like their personal stage. I read it twice and then a third time, and I will tell you the part that made my shoulders drop, because it was not the number of the share or the legal words about rights of survivorship. It was the simple line that said any sale or transfer needed my consent. And I felt a click inside that was not rage, it was alignment. I had spent years asking them to see me, and here was a document that already did. You know how people talk about empowerment like it is a motivational poster? Well, mine looked like a county website with no style and a search bar that barely works. I created an account. I pulled the recorded deed. I set alerts for any filing on the parcel. And I called the bank listed on the old home equity paperwork to confirm whether my consent clause was on file, and when the rep said they would add a note that no new lien or refinance could happen without my signature, I said thank you, with a calm voice that felt like the first real inhale of the whole week. Maybe you're wondering if that was petty, and I will say it straight, it was not petty. It was the first time I used the rules that have always been used on me, while they were posting photos from a private cabana. I was making sure that my name meant something other than the person who takes the bins to the curb, and if that sounds cold, remember that they called this whole trip family time and could not find a chair for me at the table. I did one more thing before I closed the laptop, and it was not dramatic, it was just decisive. I moved every cent I had ever stashed in the so-called family emergency account into my own account, because I put that money there and somehow it always turned into Brooke's opportunity fund, and I left the account open with a balance of exactly 0, which is more honest than the way it had been used for years. Then I put my phone face down and let their messages pile up unanswered, and as I went to bed I said to myself that this time I would not ask for a seat. I would build the floor under my own feet, and tomorrow I would act on that deed in a way they would never see coming. When the house went quiet and their vacation posts turned into a steady drip of "look at us, and we earned this," I stopped waiting for anyone to do the right thing, and I did what grown people do when they are done being managed. I started calling professionals who speak in plain terms and put things in writing, because I was not going to run this through family politics again. I found a real estate attorney through a referral from a coworker who once survived a divorce that could have been a police training video. I booked a consult for the very next morning, and I brought the deed copy, the account statements, and a handwritten list of every time I had been told to be a team player while my sister was handed the trophy. Not because the list mattered legally, but because I needed to look at something that reminded me why I was in that chair. The attorney did not care about the family drama, and I respected that immediately. He cared about the chain of title and the language my grandmother used when she signed that last deed. And here is the part that most people miss, because it is not warm and fuzzy. The paper decides, and the paper was not confused. He explained that my name was not a courtesy mention. It was an actual present interest with a consent clause that blocked any refinance or sale without me. And then he pointed out something I had skimmed and not understood, that the transfer my grandmother filed years ago was a survivorship setup that vested control in me when she passed, which meant my parents had been treating the place like they were the only owners. But in the records that count, they were not the top line, and I was done apologizing for reading what they had chosen not to read. He laid out options in that dry tone lawyers use when they have seen every fight twice, and the cleanest path was not a shouting match at the front door. It was a straightforward sale handled by a title company with a cash buyer, and if my parents wanted to contest it, they could, but they would be contesting a filing that had been sitting in the county index since before Brooke learned to drive, which is to say they had time to care and did not. I asked about the timeline, and he said that with an off-market cash offer and a cooperative title officer, we could move faster than anyone expected, especially with me holding the documents everyone else would scramble to find. I walked out of that office feeling something I had not felt since high school when I fixed a mess in the school newspaper, and nobody could take it from me. Not joy exactly, more like steadiness. And I went straight to a realtor who specializes in quiet sales to buyers who do not need bank approval, the kind of buyers who show proof of funds and do not bring a committee to the kitchen island to debate paint colors. I told her I needed confidentiality. I told her there would be no sign in the yard. I told her I would handle access, and I told her I wanted an offer that left no oxygen for family theater, and she did not flinch. She said, "Send me the vesting deed and the attorney's letter, and I will line up 2 buyers by tomorrow." And I sent everything before I left her parking lot. That night the group chat pinged with a photo of Brooke holding a drink with a caption about sister time, as if the word was elastic enough to cover the part where I was home forwarding tax bills and building a sale packet. And I did what any person who has been patronized for long enough does. I reacted with a thumbs up I did not mean, and then I forwarded the property tax receipts to the title company so there would be no last-minute excuse. Because I have done too many projects at work to not respect the paperwork. The next morning the realtor called with 2 cash offers that were not insulting. She said both buyers understood the situation and could wire earnest money within a day and close within a week, and one offer came with a sweetener that made my decision simple. Early occupancy with an escrow holdback that protected me if they broke anything, which meant that once funds landed in escrow the buyers could take possession while final signatures cleared, and that detail did more for my peace than any apology my parents could ever deliver, because it meant the people who would open the door when my family came back would not be me. I signed the offer that made the path shortest and the boundaries clearest. I opened escrow with the title officer the attorney recommended. I scheduled a mobile notary because I am done rearranging my life to sit in offices that only look at their clocks. And I spent the afternoon doing the kind of boring tasks that feel like power when you have never been allowed to ask for help. I changed my mailing address. I closed the shared streaming accounts I pay for. I turned off access to the emergency fund that somehow paid for my sister's retreats, but never my dentist, and I boxed up the few things that were mine without debate, which is a smaller number than you would think for a house I have kept running my entire adult life. When the buyers wired earnest money and the title officer confirmed receipt, The realtor asked if I wanted to deliver keys or stage a lockbox, and I chose the lockbox because I wanted a clean line between what I owed and what I did not. Then I did one last thing that will sound petty until you have lived my life. I set my phone to send unknown numbers to voicemail, and I created a folder where every message from my parents would land without a preview, because I knew the next week would be a theater of panic and I was not buying a ticket. Before bed, I sent one text to the family chat that said have a safe flight home, and then I put my phone face down and told myself that by the time they landed, the definition of home would be different for all of us. Once the papers were signed and the money was safely sitting in escrow, the strangest feeling washed over me, and it was not giddiness or relief the way I had expected. It was a deep calm that made me realize how heavy I had been carrying everything for so many years without ever admitting it to myself. The house that had felt like a prison, a stage, and a dumping ground for every chore nobody else wanted was no longer mine to maintain, and for the first time I could look around without automatically scanning for something I was supposed to fix, replace, or arrange, because those problems were now somebody else's responsibility. And that thought alone gave me more peace than any apology my parents could have attempted if they had ever been capable of offering one. The buyers were efficient and respectful in a way that almost threw me off balance, because I was used to being treated like the help, the background character, the placeholder who keeps things running while the star of the show collects applause. But these people thanked me for making the transition easy. They respected the documents and the deadlines, and they did not ask me to justify why I was selling a property tied to family history. They simply honored the process as if my word and my signature were enough, and that contrast alone made me feel stronger than I had in years. In the days that followed, I moved into my new apartment, and I will admit that it was not glamorous, and it was not large, but it was entirely mine in every way that mattered, because the key in my hand was not borrowed. The bills in my name were not tied to anyone else's choices, and every item in the space was something I had chosen for myself without anyone else's approval or control. And the simplicity of that gave me more satisfaction than any so-called family vacation could have provided. Meanwhile, the messages from my parents and my sister kept rolling in like background noise. Texts with photos of Brooke in yet another outfit, updates about excursions they thought I would enjoy hearing about, and even a video of them laughing at a resort dinner table while raising a glass to what they called their perfect family getaway. And although I had once spent years letting that kind of exclusion eat me alive, this time I felt nothing but clarity, because I knew that while they were busy toasting to themselves, I was finishing something permanent that would shake the foundation of their story the second they came home. I spent my evenings double-checking the documents, confirming with the title officer that every lien had been cleared, and making sure the wire instructions were in order. Not because I doubted the process, but because I had lived my life surrounded by people who forgot details and then handed the fallout to me, so following through on every small point felt like reclaiming the parts of myself they had dismissed for years. And I made a quiet promise that I would never again let anyone tell me my work was invisible or my contributions were less than, because the very walls they were about to walk into were no longer theirs thanks to the invisible labor they had always ignored. The strangest part was how calm I was becoming as the closing date approached, because I thought I would be overwhelmed with anxiety, guilt, or hesitation, yet instead I found myself almost detached, like I was watching a story play out on a screen. One where I already knew the ending, and every time they posted another smiling group photo from their resort, I knew the impact of their return would be all the more devastating because they had not even thought to question why my silence had stretched for days. On the final day before they flew home, the buyers moved in with a smooth efficiency that made me wonder why I had ever tolerated chaos for so long. The moving truck pulled up, the keys were exchanged, and the new owners greeted me with gratitude before telling me they were excited to make new memories in the space, and I left with a strange sense of poetic justice, not the flowery kind but the blunt, undeniable kind where you realize that the very people who treated you like you were optional are about to discover that they were the ones left without a chair when the music stopped. That night I lay in bed in my small but private apartment and listened to the silence that came from knowing I had no obligations waiting for me in that old house, no plants to water for someone else's convenience, no trash bins to haul out because others had disappeared for the week, and I allowed myself the luxury of imagining the scene that was about to unfold when they returned with their luggage and their expectations. Because for once I was not the one rehearsing apologies or explanations. They were the ones walking into a truth they could not rewrite, and all I had to do was let it happen. When I finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the certainty that the calm I felt was not the eye of a storm, but the first taste of freedom, and the thought of their shock when the locks refused to turn in their hands carried me into the deepest, most peaceful rest I had known in years, because tomorrow, for the first time, the burden of proving myself would no longer belong to me. The morning the wire cleared into escrow and the title officer confirmed that every lien had been satisfied and every signature had been recorded, I felt a steadiness that did not come from triumph or spite, but from the simple relief of knowing that, for once, the facts were on my side and backed by paperwork that did not care about family stories, and because I am the kind of person who finishes a job all the way to the end, I spent that day tying off every loose thread that could be used later as a rope to pull me back into the mess I had just climbed out of, which meant I called the utility companies and closed the accounts that were in my name. I removed my cards from the auto payments that had somehow become permanent charity. I sent the Homeowners Association the recorded deed so they would update their files without waiting for a friendly chat, and I asked the title officer to send courtesy copies of the closing statement to my attorney so that any argument about what happened would be met with a timestamp rather than a debate. There was another task I had been putting off because it felt like the part that could be mistaken for cruelty if you did not know the history, yet I did it anyway because I am done letting other people's comfort outrank my sanity. And that was to deal with the belongings that were clearly my parents' personal property, the boxes of keepsakes they never sorted, the extra furniture they swore they would donate, the stacks of random things that sat in corners waiting for me to turn them into order. I hired a bonded moving crew with an inventory checklist. I stood there while they labeled and photographed every item that was not attached to the walls. I rented a small storage unit for 3 months and prepaid it. And I left a printed inventory along with a clean set of codes that would let my parents pick up their things without ever needing to speak to me, because I wanted the line between what I had done and what I had not done to be bright enough that even they could not pretend. It was blurry. When the storage manager handed me the final receipt, I forwarded the email to my attorney with one short note that said, "Please include this with the packet," and within an hour, he sent a formal letter to my parents' last known email addresses that said, in that dry, professional way I have come to appreciate, that effective immediately all communication regarding the property should be directed to counsel, that personal belongings had been placed in secure storage with prepaid access, and that further contact with me should be respectful and purposeful or not at all, and I cannot tell you how much calmer I felt knowing that any attempt to drag me into a screaming match would hit a wall of letterhead before it ever reached my phone. The buyers, who had already moved in under the early occupancy provision, texted to say they had changed the locks as the title company recommended and that they were grateful for how organized the handoff had been. And, while I am not a person who needs a parade, I will admit that seeing gratitude in writing for work I had done without applause for years felt like a small but necessary corrective, because it reminded me that I had never been asking for much, only for my effort to be treated as real. With the money from the sale scheduled to disperse to me once the final recording posted, I opened my online banking and did the least glamorous victory lap you can imagine. I paid off the old emergency credit card they had convinced me to open under the family banner that somehow became Brooke's travel card. I closed the account so it could never be resurrected by another speech about teamwork. I froze my credit to block any surprise inquiries that might land in my lap, and then I moved a portion of the proceeds into an account that nobody else would ever see, the kind of account that means I can make choices without asking for permission, and if that sounds transactional, it is, because for once my life is not a group project. The group text stayed loud, pictures and captions and jokes that would have once hooked me into responding just to prove I was not bitter, but this time I let the messages slide past. And late that evening a new bubble popped up from my mother that said, "We land tomorrow morning. Can you pick us up like always?" And my thumb hovered over the keyboard for a second, because the muscle memory of being the reliable one is hard to break. Yet instead of answering, I opened my email and forwarded her the attorney's packet and the storage codes with a line that said, "Please review this." And then I put my phone face down because the point of all of this was to stop auditioning for a part that had never been meant for me. Before I went to sleep, I set one more boundary that felt both small and enormous. I routed all calls from numbers not in my favorites to voicemail with a message that directed anyone with questions about the house to the title company's file number, which meant that when the plane touched down and the habit of dialing me kicked in, they would not reach me, they would reach the system I had built, and the thought of them standing at the curb with their luggage and their assumptions while the system calmly did its job gave me a kind of quiet satisfaction that no speech could deliver, because by the time they reached the front door, the story would already be written, and I would not need to narrate it for them. The first clue that the plane had landed and the car service had done its job came not from my phone lighting up with a familiar name, but from the quiet text a neighbor sent to my new number that simply said, "Your plan is unfolding and everyone on the block can hear it," which I read once and then put face down because I had already decided that if I allowed myself to be dragged into the curbside panic, I would lose the very thing I had fought to build. So I took a breath, poured coffee into a mug that belonged to only me, and let the system I had set in motion do the talking that I no longer planned to do. The voicemails stacked up faster than any day in my life. First, the cheerful message from my mother asking me to swing by the arrivals lane as if the last week had not existed. Then the tone shift when the first key failed in a lock that was no longer theirs, followed by the chorus of "I do not understand" and "Fix this now" and "How could you?" and then a long string of messages that swung from threats to pleading with the kind of speed that tells you the person has never learned to sit with the consequences of their own choices. And while there was a time I would have been shaking and trying to find the sentence that might calm everyone down, this time I let each voice fall into the folder I had created for this day and reminded myself that I had already said everything that needed saying in the documents that mattered. I listened to one message all the way through because I am not without curiosity, and it was my father, who rarely speaks unless there is a stage, trying to keep his voice steady while asking me to come over and unlock a misunderstanding. And I could hear the moment a stranger opened the door and told him they had purchased the property from a documented owner and that any dispute belonged in a lawyer's inbox. And I could hear the rustle of luggage and the sudden quiet that happens when the frame you have lived inside for decades drops away with a single sentence. And while I know some people will want me to say I felt guilty or vindictive or some mix of both, the truth is that I felt present in my life for the first time in years, and that was enough. Before they could flood my phone with another wave of chaos, I sent one text to the family chat that contained a screenshot of the attorney's letter, the storage unit access codes, the prepaid term dates, and the line that said communication going forward should be directed to counsel. And then I did something that may sound small, but was the real point of the whole plan. I turned off notifications and went about my day because I am not an emergency service for people who decided I was optional. Until the bill came due. The buyers called later to say that a man had stepped forward and asked if he could retrieve a sentimental item from the backyard, and because I had anticipated that exact moment, I had already left a locked bin with the title officer containing the obvious family keepsakes and the small items I knew they would miss the most, and the buyers were told to direct them to the bin at the title office lobby, which turned a possible scene into an errand handled during business hours, and I will not pretend that this level of preparation is not a little cold, but it is the only way I have found to keep people from rewriting the past in real time and turning me into the villain of a story I did not author. At some point, my sister posted an angry paragraph on social media about betrayal and ungrateful daughters, which a coworker forwarded to me with a nervous question mark. And I let it slide by because I have learned that public outrage is often a substitute for private accountability, and nothing I could say would change the fact that while she was hashtagging family time, I was signing the documents that ended the unpaid internship I had been doing for my own relatives since I was old enough to hold a spare key. And if that sounds harsh, I think of the years I spent financing emergencies that were never mine, and I feel steady again. That evening I took one call because there needed to be a final sentence spoken aloud, and when my mother's voice came through already halfway between tears and fury, I told her in one long breath that I had acted within the authority given to me by the deed our grandmother signed, that I had stored their belongings with prepaid access because I am not cruel, that any questions about the sale belonged to the title officer and the attorney whose information she already had, that I wished them health and ease, but would not be returning to the old role where I absorbed cost and blame while being told to smile, and that going forward I would not take calls that began with accusations and ended with orders. And before she could start the familiar loop, I ended the call because there was nothing left to negotiate. The wire hit my account the next morning with the precision that families never seem to manage, and I paid the last pieces of debt that had been tied to their choices rather than mine. I funded a cushion that meant I could take a risk without begging for permission. And I set a calendar reminder for the last day of the storage unit's prepaid term with a note that simply said choices arrive with their own schedules, which was not a threat or a lesson, just a statement of the thing I had finally learned, that if you wait for people to name your value, you will wait forever, and if you build a structure that honors it, you might finally breathe. People always ask whether I would do it again or whether it was too much, and I answer the same way every time, that when someone tells you who you are in their family, believe them, and if they tell you that you are the person who stays home, waters the plants, and takes out the trash while they toast themselves in a place you paid for, then you are allowed to decide that your name on a deed is not a decoration and your life is not a backstage pass, and you are allowed to turn the key one last time and walk toward a door that only opens for you, and when the echo settles and the world does not end, you realize the plan was never about destroying theirs, it was about building mine. And that is why I slept well that night while they stood on a curb with their luggage and a list of demands that finally had nowhere to go.